Valve is working on injecting foveated rendering into VR games that were never built for it. It works on system level, so theoretically any game can benefit from it. I think that's the biggest Steam Frame thing that has happened in the last months. We also got a new SteamOS beta update with a couple of lines in it that suggest SteamOS might soon be available on Android handhelds. We also have a new SteamVR beta and a Valve security warning that affects a lot of you watching this in Europe, including me. Let's get into it. So, Foveated Rendering. The source here is Brian Lindenhoff, the developer of VR game Clamby, and I've shown his game previously on the channel. He has basically been keeping us fed during this frame content drought. He posted a video recently showing eye-tracked foveated rendering running in his game on the Steam Frame standalone, and you can see it working. As you move your eyes, the sharp area follows. Now, foveated streaming and foveated rendering get mixed quite often, so I'll try to explain the difference. Foveated streaming is something Valve are introducing with the Steam Frame, and it's about the video encoding. Your PC renders the full frame, then when it compresses that frame to send it over the air to the headset, it spends more of the bitrate where your eyes are and less everywhere else. That saves bandwidth, and in theory it should result in a smoother PC VR stream. Now, foveated rendering is a technique that has existed for quite some time now in the VR world. It has to be implemented at the game level, and it's about hardware performance rather than bandwidth. The GPU doesn't fully render the parts you're not looking at in the first place. So this is the one that matters for raw performance. A few games do this on PlayStation VR as far as I know, and the part that makes this a story is that Brian didn't have to implement it on a game level for his game. From what he said in the video and on the Frame Discord, all he had to do was type in a launch argument, and the only reason he even had to do that is because his game is a bit old. The implication here is pretty huge. It means that newer titles would get it automatically without the developer having to do anything at all. Now, why can Valve do this when nobody else really has done this before? I think it has to do with the fact that Valve has control over every single layer in the Steam Frame. So Proton for Windows games, Fex for x86 translation, Lepton for Android, Gamescope as the compositor, and their own OpenXR runtime. When you own the whole stack, you can sit in the middle of it and change how a game is rendered without the game ever knowing. On Windows, there's no equivalent place to stand. That's why the tools that existed over there, like the now depreciated OpenXR toolkit, when the DOL swapping route, which means modifying game files, which means it breaks on anything that has to validate those files. For example, Half-Life Alyx, it's a pretty obvious example. Now, on the technical side, nobody outside Valve knows exactly how it's being done, and there has been some guesses in the community. The most common guess is variable rate shading, which is a GPU feature that lets you run the pixel shader at a lower rate in chosen regions of the screen instead of once per pixel. That's pretty much the same underlying idea as the half rate shading toggle I've talked about on the Steam Machine and on the Steam Deck, except here it's applied selectively based on where your eyes are looking instead of across the whole image. The other approach would be quad views, where you render multiple views at different resolutions and composite them, and most people seem to think that's not what's happening here, so the main theory is gonna be half rate shading. There are also people who think this shouldn't be possible at all, and their argument is also worth understanding. If you change the effective resolution of parts of the image, then anything in the game that assumes a fixed pixel size can break. For example, post-processing that works in pixels rather than screen space, shaders that do their own filtering, UI that gets drawn at a specific scale. So even if this injector works, I think we should expect a compatibility list with games rather than a magic switch that works everywhere. Another VR headset, Pimax, has an injector and they have a compatibility list for exactly this reason, and that list isn't very long. On the actual numbers, foveated rendering usually means the game can perform about 20 to 30% better, kind of depending on the game and how aggressively you tune the fall off of this space you're looking at. On the Steam Frame, a 20 to 30% increase would be a lot. That's the difference between a game being unplayable and a game becoming verified. Now, there is one caveat, and that is image quality. In Brian's video, you can see the peripheral detail drop, and it's pretty obvious on a recording. That's going to be always the case with foveated rendering because the camera capturing the footage doesn't move with the eyes the way we do, so you can see how it lowers detail on the whole image. But supposedly in practice that's not noticeable because it does follow your eyes, so the thing you're going to be looking at is going to be sharp and everything else you're not really going to notice its lower quality. The big open question is scope, and it's the one everybody is asking. Does this apply to games running standalone on the headset? Does it also work when you're streaming from a PC? So even something like the Steam machine, which is on the lower end, can take advantage of both foveated streaming and foveated rendering to make VR a lot easier to run. Nothing confirmed on that, this is all speculation. It's possible that if this lives in Proton and Gamescope, then a Linux PC running SteamOS with a VRS capable GPU should be able to do the same thing for PC VR titles, and Windows gets left out, which would be a funny outcome given how long Linux has been the worst platform for VR. And there's also an argument that the latency works against you for streaming with this setup, because by the time the frame is rendered, encoded, sent, decoded and displayed, your eyes have already moved from that point that you were looking at, and that gap is bigger for rendering than it is for encoding, so maybe foveated streaming and foveated rendering are not going to be able to work together. We really don't know. Also, would this work for flat screen 2D games on the Steam frame in standalone? The principle is pretty much the same, you're still moving your eyes to look at something even if it's a floating screen in the distance. And if this works, I think that would be a pretty big deal. If you guys are enjoying this breakdown and you're into Steam hardware, gaming handhelds and cool tech, I do all of that on this channel, consider subscribing. Moving on to our second topic, SteamOS beta release. Valve pushed 3.8.25 to the beta and preview channels on Saturday. You can opt in by going to settings, system update channel. But listen to this first because there is a catch. There is a known issue on the beta with degraded performance in cases where composition is required, which includes having FSR enabled. That's the built-in FSR on SteamOS, both on the Steam Deck and in Steam Machine. That issue is already fixed in the current stable release that we have, 3.8.16, and Valve is saying affected users may want to sit on this stable release until the fix reaches beta. So if you're on beta and you have FSR on and things feel worse than they should, that's why. Also, if you want to have Decky Loader working, do not update to the beta, don't update immediately when it releases into stable either. I can't believe I have to keep saying this every time I talk about SteamOS update, but yeah, the updates break Decky, especially if you have a lot of plugins that affect the Steam Deck UI. So if you want that working, just stay off the updates for a little bit. Now this update adds preliminary support for the Steam Frame wireless adapter. There's also support for waking the Steam machine with the original 2015 Steam controller wireless adapter, which is 11-year-old hardware getting new support in 2026. I like that. I don't think there's a lot of people using the original Steam controller, but it says about how long Valve keeps things alive. There is also a fix for the Steam machine waking up immediately after going to sleep, and that rare bug where CPU performance stayed degraded until you rebooted the machine. I personally have not had that bug, but my Steam machine wakes up every time I put it to sleep. I basically have to put it to sleep twice, and this is one of the quirks that I really don't like about, and I'm going to talk more about that in my Steam machine review. Now the line in this SteamOS update I found most interesting is in the non-Valve devices section. Initial gamepad support for the MSI Claw 8X, initial gamepad support for the Conquer Fit, and initial gamepad support for the Ion Neo Pocket S2. Those last two are Snapdragon handhelds. They ship with Android, and Valve is adding their controllers to the SteamOS input stack. Why would Valve write drivers for controllers on hardware SteamOS can't run on? Now, I've been talking about SteamOS on ARM hardware for a while now, and we know it will be running on the Steam frame, and we have speculated how cool it would be to have it running on an Android handheld, and this might actually become a reality pretty soon. I think SteamOS on ARM handhelds is a real target for Valve, and it's not just a Steam frame specific thing. The Steam phone might be real. But no, yeah, in all reality, I would be careful about calling this SteamOS for Android specifically because SteamOS is Linux, and what's being added here is Linux driver support for devices that happen to ship Android from the factory. But the direction is the same, either way, and if you own a Pocket S2 or something in that class, I think this is the first concrete sign that you might get an official option one day. I just hope they add it to my Odin tree so I can finally test real SteamOS on it. I could be wrong on how far Valve takes this, but I don't see why they wouldn't do it. I think the biggest issue with this would be supporting different devices, but let me know, what do you think? Are we going to see SteamOS or something like it on Android handhelds and phones soon? Moving on, SteamVR Beta 2.17.7 landed on the 10th, and this is a pretty smaller one. A recenter, which is the long press on the system button, is now cancelable with B, and the exit button behaves more consistently with Steam. They also fixed some cases of the dashboard bar disappearing, and you now get a notification when the headset frame rate changes, which is useful when something is quietly dropping you to a lower refresh rate and you can't tell why. And there are additional improvements to wired headset support on Linux, which previously required third-party add-on layers. That last one keeps showing up in these notes, and it lines up with everything else. Valve is really doing the unglamorous work of making VR on Linux not need community workarounds, which it has needed for years, and they are doing this probably because we need the Steam Machine and the Steam Frame to work together really good. On the Steam Link side, they fixed being unable to switch the active laser pointer hand when using hand tracking, and they also have some stability fixes. On OpenXR, apps can now configure stage space as unrecenterable, and there are better integrations between headsets with cameras and chaperone functionality. Also, the current SteamVR beta cycle requires the Steam Client beta for the new UI to refresh, so if you opt into that one, you also need the other one. And something small to round out the Steam Frame and VR stuff, the Steam Frame startup movie has been data mined with this latest update, and that's the boot animation you will see when the headset powers on. It's nothing functional and nothing you can learn from it, but it looks pretty cool, and people are starved for frame content, so it has made the rounds. And finally, moving to the last topic, the one that actually affects people watching this, Valve emailed European customers about a security incident at Seva Logistics, which is the company that handles Steam hardware shipping in Europe. Attackers were in Seva systems between the 29th of July and the 1st of August. Seva told Valve on the 7th of August, and Valve started sending notification emails on the 10th. What's involved is shipping data, names, countries, street address, phone numbers, email address, and according to some of the reporting, the product type and the price paid for that product. So that is a lot of data to have on somebody. Seva holds that information for 90 days per order, and that window is what decides whether you've been affected. Payment information, passwords, and Steam Guard codes are all fine, and the reason for that is because Seva never really had access to any of it. Valve says you don't need to change your password or touch any of your Steam account settings, but the rest of the data, that's a pretty big security breach. And what this actually turns into is phishing and social engineering attacks, and I would take that part very seriously. Valve's own wording is to expect fake messages by email, SMS, or phone that mention your hardware order and look like they're from Steam or from Valve or a courier. The dangerous part is that whoever has this data can quote your own address back to you to prove that they are legitimate, and that's exactly the thing most people use to judge whether a message is real or it's a scam. The pattern to watch out for is small customs fee, a redelivery fee, or a link asking you to sign in somewhere to verify your order. Treat all of it as fake. Steam support only ever happens through the official help page, never over email, Steam chat, or Discord, and nobody from Valve or a delivery company is going to ask you for a password or a Steam Guard code. Outside of Valve and Steam and deliveries, if you get a message, regardless if it's about delivery or not, and you're not sure, don't click anything on it, especially if there's a link. If it's a delivery, you can go to the courier site yourself and you can look up a tracking number that you already have, and that will cover you for pretty much every version of this delivery scam. But in addition, the data that was stolen can be used against you not just for deliveries but for all types of scams. Just be extra wary in the coming months. This is a pretty serious breach, and there's a lot that can be done with this data. So that's what I have for you today, a Foveated Rendering injector that could lift performance across the whole VR catalog if it works as broadly as it looks, a SteamOS beta quietly adding controller support for Snapdragon handhelds, a SteamVR beta continuing to fix Linux VR, and a data breach that has nothing to do with any of that, but you should absolutely know about it if you ordered hardware in Europe. If you guys enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like. If you hated it, leave a dislike and let me know what I can do to improve. And if you're into Steam, Steam Deck, Steam hardware, gaming handhelds, and cool tech, consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.